Though many of us believed most American racial issues were fairly well addressed in the 1960s and 1970s, in good measure because many of us have friends and relationships of mixed races, racial issues have come to the forefront of politics just in time to muddy the waters of the 2020 presidential election. Witness the recent discussion of white supremacy during Tuesday's presidential debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, when the president was challenged to decry white supremacy, and Joe Biden was given an opportunity to denounce violent acts of Antifa. Many issues and human impulses swirl in this vortex of unrest, and this seems like a reasonable time in which to consider some of the forces that give context to the ongoing struggle and to the wounds that might heal quickly if more energy went toward understanding and help than to exacerbating the problems. Don, would you introduce us to the concept of the politics of envy and how it becomes a fertile field for seeds of unrest and potentially violent change in society?
Thanks, Cindy. This is a critical part of my thinking and inner world since basically becoming more aware a few decades ago of the political spectrum and how different people view things. And I think some of the quotes of the famous economist Thomas Sowell express it very, very well. And it does have a lot to do with envy. And it has to do with ideas like, well, how much of what I make is your fair share? Ideas like that. And it goes to these concepts go to the core of who we think we are as a nation. And if we think that we're all to help each other out, and the government mandates that and does it the way that it seems best to the government because we elect the government, well, that's the way that those on the left view American culture, American society, the way that they feel that the whole political game is supposed to work, that we shouldn't be have people that are too successful because they're doing that at the expense of others, and that money could be better used elsewhere. And it is that kind of a judgment call that really, I think, goes to the core of the idea in a subtle way that many people miss of American individual liberty. We're a nation that's built on individual liberty. Now, many people think that it's that very concept that causes the imbalances, and to some extent that's true. But what people often miss is that a lot of the imbalances that exist are due to cronyism and insider special favors, but not all of them. Well, for instance, the private Federal Reserve can pick winners and losers because it has the power of the purse over the whole society. Now, we can't, it's a subtle thing though. We can't always assume that somebody that's rich is rich because the Federal Reserve wants them to be rich. There's always a mix. And so nothing is ever 100%. And we have to learn how to sort out, well, who's operating from what premise and why. So it's a murky field, actually by design, because if you are a good monopolist, the powerful movers and shakers that were alluded to by George Carlin when he said, "You have owners, they own you. It's a big club and you're not in it." Well, if you were one of those people that's designing that system or solidifying your power within that system, you remain as invisible as possible. And this is really just common sense. It's not a conspiracy in the sense that they are trying to hide their evil. Well, yeah, they are. So maybe it is a conspiracy theory, but it's it's just obvious common sense on their part not to reveal what they're doing. And unfortunately, that's where we're at in this game. So as Americans seek to get control of their country again, we have to deal with these issues of people that are hiding in the shadows. It's a part of the game, and the whole idea of making life fair by dividing things more equally, guess who is going to pose as the people who are going to help us divide things up equally? Well, the people in the levers of power, the people that have taken those positions in elected and non-elected positions in the bureaucracy. They're the ones who believe they're entitled to fulfill that role. So they're quite happy with socialism. So the naive people that think, well, we vote for socialism and we, the voters, determine how that works, are actually quite naive in terms of understanding how things are set up and how things have always functioned in the world. So we can think about the future of a more socialistic America that's a little bit more like Europe as being something appealing to the left because they feel they've gotten the short end of the stick, but they are actually falling into that trap. And those who understand American independence and rugged individualism, they see through that trap, and there's an impasse in trying to get those two sides to communicate with each other.
That reminds me, what you just said reminds me a lot of the video, The Five Basic Forms of Government Explained, because, and you can speak more about this if you would like to, from the understanding given people by this video, there really are only two forms of government, which are oligarchy and a republic. That this promise, this politics of envy, this promise that, hey, other people have things that you don't have, you can get what they have, it leads into, it's like a big drain that everyone circles that leads down into socialism, which is really just a form of communism. And because there aren't really careful checks and balances on the system, it either degrades into an oligarchy or in many instances actually begins as an oligarchy. Would you want to comment on that?
Okay, sure. The idea that people want to have a society where there aren't these discrepancies between the rich and the poor that are so glaring that they feel that life isn't fair. There's a part of that resonates in all of us, and I don't know if there's a way around that other than to for each person to deal with it in their own spiritual and mental, with their own inside of themselves, with their own individual capacity, to say, I'm where I am because partly because of fate and partly because of the choices I've made, and you can always aspire to be better. And then when you're choosing your path, you're constantly choosing your path. So how does that work out? Well, not always for the best, because we don't always make the best choices. So what do people want as a shortcut or a way to ensure that we more often get the outcomes that we want? Well, they think it would be a good idea if there were an arbiter of fairness that would help make my choices in the system that we all own to work out for the best, and to fail as a minimal amount of possibility. Like if I didn't do outrageously bad things and didn't get thrown in prison, that I would live a prosperous life. So people see that as a shortcut. Ultimately, I see it as a natural human temptation to have a government that steps into the place of God, that wants to make life more fair. People want life to be more fair, and rather than working things out with their own divine connection, they see that government can be a way to help ensure that. And so they go about working to make government into what really is a role that is rightfully God's. I'm not sure that's what you wanted, but that's what comes to mind as what goes on inside of people that are wanting to have a more even playing field.
Well, what do you think are the origins of that 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 feeling of lack? Because you mentioned God, and reading the Old Testament, it seems as if, well, and the New Testament doesn't contradict this. It seems that God has said that He created abundance and wants people to experience abundance, and that now in the Old Testament, the times that people did not experience abundance, oftentimes were the situations in which they had fallen away, worshipped other gods, and coincidentally happened also to sacrifice children to other gods. We won't go there, but my point is that from my reading of the Bible and my understanding of the nature of God and the character of God, abundance seems to be the natural order. And we look around the earth and we see abundance everywhere. It's autumn now. We in the northern hemisphere, we see the leaves falling. There seem to be more than enough of everything in nature. And how is it that we even feel that we don't have enough as people? Where does that sense of lack come from?
Well, what comes to mind is, as I think about the Old Testament and the abundance that God promises there, and man's nature of not seeming to have as much as he wants. A lot of that is based on envy, of course, and thou shalt not covet is one of the 10 Commandments, and I think it's a very, very important one. And I think oftentimes we hide this from ourselves, but I believe that really the politics of envy is very, very big on the left, and that's their primary motivation, is they see somebody that has more than they do, and they don't think that's fair. They're not okay with that. Now, sometimes they may be right. I'm thinking in particular about how the King Saul and King David and what led up to that. And Samuel, the prophet, who said to the people when they asked for a king before Saul was king, you don't realize what an evil thing you do when you ask for a king, because God was already their king and had given them prophets, and they were not supposed to have a hierarchy. And then what happens when Saul establishes his kingdom? There is a amassing of this great wealth in a centralized fashion, and then there are people that can't really fit in with that thing that's been established, that hierarchy, and they are the outcasts, and they're the ones that went to David, because in the wilderness, when after David had been anointed to be king to replace Saul, when Saul fell out of favor with the Lord through disobedience, and when those outcasts were in the wilderness, they were people who had seen a lot of their wealth be confiscated by the powers that be in that day. So there is this ebb and flow, and it isn't always that the wealthy deserve to have the wealth that they do. Often they don't, and there are different periods of revolutions that come and go, and some of them are based on a true need of the people, and sometimes they're orchestrated. Right now, we're living between two opposing potential revolutions, where one version of the revolution mindset wants to have the American unfair system replaced by something more socialist, and the other sees that the unfairness in the current system is due to corruption and wants to have the corruption ended, but not the system replaced. So those are my thoughts, and I see a similar situation in the David versus Saul parallel in the Bible.
I can see that, and one of the examples that we had of the nature of people that causes them to strive and perceive lack seems to be echoed in what crabs do to one another when crabs are put in a pail together. They obviously try to climb out, but anytime they can, the other crabs will pull the escaping crab back down, so that the crabs keep one another in that situation. Whereas if they would let one another escape, it's possible that many of them, most of them, maybe all of them, would be able to get out. But the fact that they hold one another down seems to prevent anyone from escaping, and that, I believe, that projects onto where we are as people, that if we're okay with someone else doing well, we don't point to the person like body snatchers and say, wait, someone's getting out of an uncomfortable lifestyle. That goes a long way toward facilitating improvement in the human condition. But I also just want to stay for a moment on that subject of lack and the perception of lack. We often hear that there is a lot of new technology on the horizon. We've heard the number thrown around that there are 6,000 patents that have been stifled because of how radically they would change human existence and really have potential to break the control system. Things like free energy and water that can be cleansed and reused so that there's absolutely no shortage of water and things of that nature. So I'm wondering if there is actual lack in the earth, or if there's just bad management. Because if we had some of these resources released through the technology in some of these patents that I imagine most people who are listening know what we're talking about, but we'll have some examples on the screen of things that have been stated, things like the med bed that can cure all disease, and black box technology for generating electricity that's not harmful and clean and pretty much immeasurable, and things of that nature. So I know, Don, I've heard you talk about just how things are poorly managed as opposed to there being actual lack.
Yeah, I do believe that. Poor management is a nice, kind way to put it. I think what has actually happened is more along the lines of monopoly systems that have been developed by people that see themselves as the stewards of the earth, in a not so good way, where they've designed systems that give them control, and they believe that it's their role to make sure that things don't get exploited. Oddly enough, this would include the oil industry, and people would say, well, we're raping the world for oil, but what's actually happened is not exactly that. We have a petrodollar system because the gold standard no longer worked, and the oil isn't actually being used. It's being held in reserve by the monopoly structure so that the fuel doesn't become too cheap and too abundant. So it's the resources that are actually underpinning the economic system. And if we did have an abundance of oil, which is, I'm of the the opinion that their oil is actually abiotic, that it didn't come from dinosaurs. But even if it did, there's a lot of evidence that there is way more oil, and we're not anywhere near peak oil, that it's declining. All that is basically a ruse in order to maintain a tight control on the supply so that the economic system doesn't come crashing down. If we lived in a world of abundant resources, oil being one, the easiest example, then there wouldn't be the ability to peg a currency to that commodity as it is now. So the whole idea of abundance with an economic system that in which something has value because it's scarce, it's a built-in gotcha. It's a built-in problem that is yet to be solved by mankind. I think returning to a standard like a gold standard is part of the solution, but a lot of these problems, we have to look behind what's really going on and say, yeah, energy is a big deal. Free energy would actually change that dynamic so that if things are abundant, then what's the basis for your economic system? How do you go from a petrodollar to an energy dollar if there's an abundance of free energy? Well, how do the economics of that work, and how does that get structured? Those are big questions that humanity hasn't really faced yet, because we've had these custodians of the commodities that have been in charge of global resources for a pretty long period of time. And it needs to change, but the path forward isn't at all clear.
So just to bring this into the context of what's happening in America right now, with this last month and 2 days leading up to the presidential election, this perception of lack that's been created, whether it's real, which I tend to think that it's not, that there really isn't lack, that it's contrived, that this feeling that some people have things and other people don't have things and it's not fair, is being really imposed on people maybe who weren't even really feeling that before, in the context of race, and stating that that some races have more advantages and therefore a better life than other races. I think that's undeniable. That that some people do have advantages and begin life with advantages. I'm not sure it has as much to do with race as it does with the lifestyle that's been embraced by different people, and we can show statistics about how much better children with a father in the home do in school and in many other circumstances. That's becoming more and more rare as time goes by, that a child would have his or her father in the home. But it's just some of those basic things that give a family stability they're not things that come in from the outside, such as money or advantages, education. They're things that actually flow out of the relationships in the family, and just that people feel more secure and feel safe in their homes. And feeling safe in your home has actually been tied to what's considered to be white privilege. And some of that depends on your neighborhood, which would be and due to an economic force. But some of feeling safe in your home, I think, just has to do with who you're living with, and if you feel safe with the people that you're living with. And I personally, I would not, if that's tied to race, then that I don't know that can be changed. But personally, I don't believe that is tied to race. I think that that anyone can choose, although it's difficult when it hasn't been modeled for you. I believe that it's possible for people to make decisions in their lives and choose a spouse that's, has potential to be a stable relationship and a responsible co-parent. And I don't necessarily see some of these things tied to race.
Yeah, I think that I agree with you. It's really about culture. And I think that the race is simply a way to presume that cultures are different. And I'm talking about culture not in the sense of, the difference between different national, what were previously considered ethnicities like Italian, Spanish, German, French, all the different European subgroups. I'm thinking of culture in terms of the values of Western culture. And I think a lot of people who have seen the erosion of some of the values that Western culture has always upheld, such as the values of the family, have, and by that I mean a nuclear family as being the bedrock of society and the stability of that as being a good thing. There, that people that have seen that decline have seen that it's actually Western civilization that's under attack. So that's really where the idea of lack comes from, is when something is breaking down, when a culture, and in this case the whole Western culture of civilization has been breaking down, first in Europe, then in America. Taking the long-term view here, people have a sense of lack. They see what's missing, and the easy solution is, well, it's the economics, and we need to divide up the money better. Well, people don't realize that the economics are actually just based on the values of the culture, the things that the culture values. So when a culture becomes unhealthy, its values begin to be degraded, and people are poorer overall. So really, we, I think, are correct in wanting to get our culture back on track values-wise first. And one of the shortcuts that we need to actually be aware of that doesn't really work is the idea that it's all about money, the envy idea that drives a lot of the politics of the left. So the American founders knew that that our form of government was really only good for a moral and religious people. So we need to get those values right, and then there is a blessing that comes with that. The values are blessed by material goods, but the values have to underlie that, or the health of the society just isn't there. And then, of course, the health of the family depends on having common values in the family. So we are currently in a situation where there are a lot of divided families because a lot of people's politics are different based on having a different understanding of what our true foundation should be. So we are living through an era in which we get to reestablish the true foundations, and it's a time for thinking deeply about what's really important in our lives and in our culture. Mentioning individual responsibility really goes to the core of what we are as a society and how we have abdicated that by assuming that others could take care of things for us, including the education of our children. And that's one thing that Americans are starting to take back. They're realizing that the educational system has been too much of a negative influence on their children, and have begun to take back some of the control of the educational system through this COVID pandemic, however you want to look at it, has increased awareness of that. So that's a good thing, and we do need some ability for at least one parent to be able to have more free time to be able to monitor their children's education. That's still something that needs to happen, but I think the interest has been birthed in the American people to take more control over their children's education. I see that as a good thing.
Well, and I know President Trump wants to offer school choice and give parents a much broader selection to choose from when they decide about their children's education. I do believe that education and also the value for education in the home, but I think that is a big determinant of the future of how children will grow up and what their a predictor for what their lives will be like. And right now, what's happening in education is the president may have taken critical race theory out of the federal employees' training, but it's certainly very much a part of public education. And this week, one of our grandsons is learning about the difference between life in the suburbs and life in urban settings and rural settings. So they're imposing these feelings on children. This, the critical race theory that that it's not right for some people to be comfortable in the suburbs and other people to suffer in other settings. So it is a very complex issue, and it'd be great. I think the school choice has potential. It's ironic because education has been one of the institutions that have perpetuated these negative feelings of envy, class envy, but at the same time, education can provide a means for people who are struggling with less and a less comfortable life, a less rewarding life. Education can be potentially a means, if administered correctly, for them to achieve a richer life. And when I say rich, I don't mean necessarily money. I mean a more rewarding life, a fuller life, a life that when they look back at the end of their life, they can feel good about most of it. So that's the education is huge, and we all know that about the dumbing down of America. It's not just the fact that this critical race theory is being imposed on children. It's the fact that they're just simply not being taught as well as has been experienced by children in the past.
That's certainly true, and education really isn't primarily about the dollars or the facilities. It's about the instruction, and books are available in public libraries, and it's not a question of the expense of the books even. A lot of that is actually, a lot of the textbooks have a lot of untruths in them that could simply be eliminated, but you do want relevant education. However, it's not relevant by compromising values, it's relevant by implementing values. So that's the kind of education I think we need to get back to. And as you were talking there, Cindy, I couldn't help but think of one of my, I guess it's one of my favorite movies, but not really favorite in the sense that I have watched it many times, but just that I come back to it when I think about education, and I think about some of the false ideas that we have about what education should be and in the modern world. And that movie is To Sir with Love, where a black teacher in a inner city is teaching some kids about honor and respect and how to really get their values right and make their way in the world through individual responsibility. And they hate him at first, but they love him at the end. And that's really what education is about. It's about doing things you don't want to do to that in the moment that improve yourself and give you a better life. So that self-discipline needs to be part of each individual student's responsibility, and it's the parents that nurture that in the home. But and are now, I think, beginning to realize that to a greater extent. A lot of the institutions that we've taken for granted within America are now, we realize they've been crumbling and we haven't even noticed, and it's time to begin a rebuilding process, and that starts in the home.
So, in a specific sense, just referring to some of the discussion during the presidential debate earlier this week, is there, because the president wants to defend the suburbs, preserve the suburbs, and clearly, now I'm not saying that Joe Biden supports Antifa, although he did not clearly denounce Antifa Tuesday night. We see groups like Antifa and Black Lives Matter threatening the peace of the suburbs, and you know, it's always been sad to me that when people riot, they riot often in their own communities. Now that's not the professional people that are leading this, that I believe are leading this. The paid agitators that are getting people to riot and loot and burn. But it's a sad thing to see when people become angry that they destroy their own communities. That's always been a sad thing to me. Well, now that angst is breaking out beyond the inner city and coming to suburbs in one degree or another. Some, towns that aren't like huge urban areas that are just a little bit more of a have a more community feel to them. So where can we go with this? How can we reconcile the need for people to feel like they're not being cheated with a wish by the president and, of course, those who live in the suburbs to preserve the suburbs and the middle class way of life? Because from my understanding, when socialism, communism is imposed, it's not, the people don't have available to them the kind of middle class existence that is available in the United States currently. So do you see a way to reconcile the feelings of frustration of the people who are rioting? Now, obviously the agitators are just doing a job, but they do find frustration in the people, or nobody would take to the streets. So what do you see a way forward for America from here?
Ultimately, it is spiritual. And what I see is a lot of blame shifting where people are taught that the other guy is the problem and we don't assume responsibility. Now, assuming responsibility also works collectively. It means that we as a culture need to own that we've gotten off track and how to not only get our personal lives in an order of honesty and integrity, but also the lives of our elected officials. And that means that we need true reporting. That means that people that have hidden the truth about corruption need to be exposed. So that return of integrity is going to be uncomfortable. Right now we're in a situation where a lot of the blame is being placed in the wrong places. And people on the left like to say or believe that that President Trump and his supporters are blaming immigrants for the problems. Well, that isn't really true, I don't believe. I'm sure you could find some that do think that way, but by and large, President Trump's supporters recognize that corruption in government and institutions is the primary cause of a lot of our problems. And the fact that the monetary system has been used to buy off people that will allow the corrupt people to stay in power. And I'm hopeful that there will be justice that will be able to come soon, and we'll be able to see that there have been criminals in high places, and some of the people that we have been taught to trust the most. And I believe this problem is worldwide, because in many ways we have a worldwide system. A lot of these means of commerce and trade cross political and geopolitical boundaries. So I do see that really helping to uncover corruption is a major way forward. And I do believe that in order for that to happen, we have to learn to love truth again. And that means not necessarily believing everything we're told. That means researching, finding out what is true, and holding fast to what is true and exposing the lies. So as we do that, we find allies, we find people that have discovered the same things, and that's a natural process. And I do believe that process is accelerating. I do believe that there will be a reversal coming soon through some of the processes that President Trump has helped to start up, the Durham investigation and all of that, and that things will begin to be declassified that was actually not in the national security interest, but in the interests of those who have been hiding corruption in high places. So I do see that as a way forward, and fortunately we do have a way for each and every individual who is connected online to be able to engage in that process. Various social media, various ways to share things, and humans are creative. And there's a lot of attempts to censor, but there's always ways around them. Instead of using text, you can use screenshots. Instead of using different articles, text, you can use memes, and sarcasm is very, very hard for the algorithms to identify. So there's all kinds of opportunities there, and it's a time for the creativity of the human spirit to shine forth. And ultimately that comes from God. So we find our individual connection with God. We plug into where He is leading us to go in the battle. We realize that God does always win, and that we get to be participants in that process. And in the same time, we're refining ourselves. We learn the internal lessons based on what's going on around us, and we become better people in the process. At the same time, we're helping our culture to move forward and away from darkness and into light. So I think it's an exciting time we're living in.
It certainly is exciting. May you live in interesting times, the Chinese blessing / curse. We definitely find ourselves in interesting times. And recently the president mandated that critical race theory training for federal employees be ended. And I think I'm hearing what you're saying about people learning about corruption. Maybe critical race theory could be replaced by something like corruption theory, and people learning how they have been deceived. And I think that one thing that I want to emphasize is that this is not what you're talking about, has not been limited to just one race. This is something that has affected humans across the board. And I know that some people have been more oppressed at various times, but now I think the oppression that has been experienced by African Americans and others who have particularly struggled in this country is now being felt by people who perhaps until now have not experienced it that much. And as it spreads, I think that people are becoming, as you said, more aware of that there is oppression, and beginning to ask where it's coming from, who's imposing it. And as we've heard many times, the problem of the people who are the overlords one of their issues is to make sure that we all fight each other. Because if we stop fighting each other, we will realize that we all have a common oppressor, and united we will be able to overthrow that oppression.
And one of the core values of American independence and liberty and the 1776 mindset is the limited government, and that presumes the idea that people in power ought to be mistrusted. And that's always true. The naive view that those that are attracted to power and assume political office and become career politicians, they're the best of us. That's very, very naive and simple-minded, and deserves to be ridiculed. Unfortunately, that is the mindset that the mainstream media is constantly establishing as what reality is. They want you to trust the establishment because they are allied with that establishment. They prop each other up, the corrupt media and the corrupt politicians. So Americans are wising up to that game, and I think that that's an encouraging thing. That means that, of course, there's going to be some bumps in the road, and everything is not going to be smooth, as the dangerous time for a cornered animal is in his last days before he's captured, and that's the time that we're in now. So it's also a good time to be prepared for whatever unrest might happen.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Poli-Psych Podcast. We hope that you have enjoyed this discussion. If you have, we ask that you please click like. We also ask that you please consider subscribing to us on YouTube, subscribing to us on BitChute, and since you can't follow us on Twitter because we've been suspended, we request that you tweet our video on our behalf if you have enjoyed it. Again, thank you for joining us, and until next time, take care.